The river moves through darkness before Egypt has a name. It slides north beneath a sky crowded with stars, carrying silt from faraway highlands no one in the valley can see. On either side of its water, the land changes almost by the length of a footstep. There is the narrow strip of damp black earth, smelling of mud, reeds, fish, and new growth. Beyond it rises the dry country, pale and sharp, where stone ridges catch the first light and the desert waits without hurry. Long before a pharaoh sits on a throne, long before pyramids cut the horizon, long before scribes learn to make royal names last longer than flesh, this contrast is already teaching people how to live. The future civilization of Egypt does not begin with gold, armies, or monuments. It begins with a river that returns, a desert that presses close, and scattered communities learning that survival here depends on memory. Around the centuries before 3100 BC, the Nile Valley is not empty, and it is not primitive in the careless way that word is sometimes used. It is a world of fish traps, grinding stones, clay jars, woven mats, hearths, cattle, boats, and paths worn into desert edges by feet and hooves. People know where the water stands after the flood, where wild plants can be gathered, where stone can be taken for blades, where roots cross the low desert, and where the dead should rest. Their world is not yet the Egypt of the first dynasties, but it already contains the habits that will make Egypt possible. The beginning of Egypt is not a single doorway. It is a slow gathering of signs, so quiet at first that only archaeology can hear it clearly. The valley itself is a corridor. To the north, the river spreads toward the delta, dividing into channels, marshes, islands, pools, and reed beds before reaching the Mediterranean. To the south, it narrows between cliffs and deserts, flowing past places that will later become famous under names like Abydos, Naqada, and Hierakonpolis. But in this earlier world, those names are not yet written as history. They are places of settlement, burial, craft, movement, and ambition. Some communities are small, others are larger and better connected, gathering people, goods, and perhaps authority around them. What survives in the record suggests a landscape of uneven growth, where one village is not simply like the next. The climate is part of the story from the beginning. North Africa has not always looked like the familiar map of sand and dry wind. Earlier in the Holocene, parts of the Sahara hold grasslands, lakes, seasonal water, wild animals, and human groups who move through a much greener world. But climates shift, rains weaken, and places that once supported life become harder to trust. This change does not happen overnight, and scholars still debate the exact pace and local effects of the drying. Yet the broad movement is clear enough. Across generations, the Nile becomes more than one fertile river among many possible landscapes. It becomes a refuge, a route, a boundary, and a magnet. People who know cattle, pottery, hunting, gathering, and desert navigation find themselves drawn toward the reliable ribbon of water. Reliability, though, is not the same as simplicity. The Nile gives life, but it does not give it gently. Floods rise and withdraw according to rhythms that must be watched. Too little water can mean hunger, too much can damage fields and homes. The timing matters. The memory of previous floods matters. Communities that learn to read these patterns hold an advantage, and over time, that advantage becomes social. Those who organize labor, store grain, settle disputes, remember boundaries, and speak for the unseen powers behind fertility and danger may begin as practical figures. but practicality has a way of turning into authority. The state is still in the future, but some of its bones are already present in everyday life. There is another force at work, quieter than floodwater but just as important. The Nile makes movement possible. Boats, even simple ones, can carry people, jars, stone, food, ideas, and prestige. The river binds distant communities into a long conversation. A style of pottery appears in one region and echoes in another. A rare stone reaches a place where it does not belong naturally. A symbol carved on a surface begins to mean something beyond the hand that made it. None of this requires a kingdom at first, but it creates the conditions in which a kingdom can be imagined. Archaeology sees this beginning only in fragments. It finds pottery broken into pieces, graves disturbed by time, animal bones, charred seeds, stone tools, beads, pallets, pigments, and traces of houses that once seemed ordinary to the people who used them. No single discovery fully accounts for the rise of Egypt. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is unevenly preserved. Floodplain settlements are especially difficult because later water, farming, building, and silt can bury or erase them. Deserts, by contrast, sometimes protect what the river valley consumes. The dry margins may preserve the dead better than the wet land preserves the living. Still, the fragments speak. They suggest people who are not waiting passively for civilization to arrive, but actively shaping their world. They experiment with crops and herding. They make pottery not only for storage and cooking, but eventually for identity and display. They bury the dead with objects, at first modestly, then with increasing distinction in some communities. They use pigments, perhaps on bodies, objects, or ritual surfaces. They value materials that come from far away, which means exchange networks already reach beyond any single village. They craft images of animals with a force that feels more than decorative crocodiles, bulls, birds, desert creatures, and hybrid forms with meanings no later text explains completely. In this early valley, leadership may begin in many overlapping ways. A successful herder, a ritual specialist, a negotiator, a household controlling exchange, a lineage associated with ancestors, a figure who can gather labor at the right time. Any of these roles might harden into something larger under pressure. The transformation is not the same everywhere. Some settlements remain local, others grow into centers, some burials become richer, some crafts become more specialized. Some symbols become more commanding. Gradually, across the long centuries before 3100 BC, the question is no longer only how one community survives beside the flood. It becomes how many communities can be drawn into one order. By the time the first crown rises from this landscape, it will seem in later memory almost inevitable, as if Egypt has always been waiting to become Egypt. But the deeper story is less simple and more interesting. Nothing in the mud of the Nile demands pyramids. Nothing in the desert cliffs automatically produces pharaohs. The civilization that begins around 3100 BC emerges from choices repeated across generations, from environmental pressure, from exchange, from rivalry, from ritual imagination, and from the growing ability of some people to turn local authority into something vast. The first Egypt is not born suddenly from emptiness. It gathers itself out of river silt, desert dust, cattle tracks, grave goods, flood memories, and the patient human need to make a dangerous world feel ordered. And somewhere in that gathering, before the names become clear, before the royal tombs grow immense, before the palette of Narmer gives the beginning a face, the Nile Valley crosses an invisible threshold. The communities along its banks are still made of households, fields, animals, boats, tools, and ceremonies. But beneath them, a larger structure is forming. The river is no longer only a place to live. It is becoming the spine of a kingdom. The river that becomes the spine of Egypt is never only generous. It is beautiful, but it is not kind in any simple sense. It brings black mud into a land of pale stone and sand, then withdraws and leaves people to read what it has done. It feeds fields, fills marshes, carries boats, breeds fish, thickens reeds, and makes travel possible through a world where the desert can end a journey almost as quickly as it begins. But it also rises without asking permission. It covers boundaries. It changes paths. It can come too weak, too strong, too early, or too late. Long before kings claim to command the two lands, the Nile teaches the first lesson of Egyptian civilization. Life depends on order, and order must be made before it can be believed. To stand beside the river in the centuries before 3100 BC is to live inside a calendar written in water. The year does not feel like an abstract number. It arrives as a sequence of physical changes. The low season exposes banks, mud flats, and channels. The rise begins as distant rains far to the south send their message downstream. Then the flood spreads across the valley, soaking the ground, renewing the fields, and leaving behind the fine dark silt that later Egyptians will associate so deeply with their own land that the very idea of Egypt becomes tied to black earth. The desert beyond remains the red land, dry, bright, and dangerous, but also full of stone, minerals, roots, and sacred distance. Between these two worlds, the people of the early Nile Valley learn that survival lies in the narrow, fertile middle. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the power of the flood is not only agricultural, it creates habits of attention. A community that farms beside the river must know when to plant, when to harvest, where to keep animals, where to store grain, and how to recover when the water behaves differently from memory. Fields do not organize themselves. Channels need clearing. Boundaries need to be remembered after the flood blurs them. Food needs to be stored against lean times. Boats need to be built and repaired. People need to coordinate work before the right moment passes. In this way, the Nile does something more subtle than feed a population. It encourages planning, measurement, negotiation, and eventually administration. The earliest farmers in Egypt do not live on wheat alone, but grain becomes one of the great foundations of the coming state. Emmer wheat and barley are especially important, along with legumes such as lentils and peas in some settlements, and flax for linen and oil. These crops connect ordinary daily life to larger social change. Grain can be counted, dried, stored, moved, redistributed, and claimed. It can feed workers away from their homes. It can support craft specialists who are not farming every day. It can become payment, offering, tax, and symbol. The road from a village granary to a royal storehouse is long, but it begins with the simple fact that food preserved in jars and bins can become power. The archaeological traces of this life are often modest, and that is part of their importance. Charred seeds, broken grinding stones, sickle blades, storage pits, fragments of mats, animal dung used as fuel, fish bones, and plant remains may not seem as dramatic as golden masks or temple walls, but they show the engine beneath everything that follows. The first Egypt is built not only by rulers, but by people who cut reeds, grind grain, mend baskets, herd cattle, fire pottery, and watch the waterline. What survives in the record suggests that this river world is practical, intimate, and deeply observed. Its people do not need monumental inscriptions to understand that the flood is the difference between abundance and anxiety. The marshes are another part of the river's gift. In the delta and along stretches of the valley, wetlands provide fish, birds, papyrus, reeds, wild plants, and grazing. They are places of food and material, but also places of imagination. Later Egyptian art will fill marsh scenes with movement, birds rising, fish flashing, cats and hunters among papyrus thickets, boats sliding through green water. Some of that later imagery belongs to elite tombs and symbolic afterlife landscapes, but its roots lie in a much older familiarity. The marsh is not empty scenery. It is a living resource zone, a border between land and water, order and wildness, daily work and sacred possibility. Cattle also matter deeply in this early world. They are wealth, food, labour, identity, and prestige. In some predynastic contexts, cattle imagery carries a force that goes beyond simple herding. Bulls, horns, and powerful animals become tied to strength and authority. This does not mean every bull image is a king, or that every herd is political, but the connection between animal power and human status grows stronger as society becomes more unequal. A household with animals stands differently from a household without them. A leader who can command herds, distribute meat, sponsor ceremonies, or display animal wealth can gather loyalty in ways that are both practical and symbolic. The Nile's role as a road may be even more transformative than its role as a field maker. A desert path requires preparation and risk, but the river offers a line of movement through the valley. Boats can carry heavy jars, stone vessels, timber, food, people, and messages more efficiently than overland travel. Even small watercraft change the scale of human connection. A settlement is no longer only what lies within walking distance. It becomes part of a longer chain. Goods from the south can move north. Objects from the delta can move upriver. Styles spread. Ritual ideas travel. Rivalries widen. Alliances become possible across distances that would otherwise divide communities into isolated worlds. Yet the river's unity should not be exaggerated too early. The Nile connects, but connection does not automatically create a state. The delta is not the same as Upper Egypt. A marshy northern landscape produces different possibilities from the narrower southern valley. Local traditions endure, burial customs vary, pottery styles shift across regions and time. Scholars still debate exactly how these local cultures interacted, competed, merged, and changed before political unification. What can be said with confidence is that the river allows difference and contact to coexist. It lets communities remain distinct while also drawing them into exchange. That tension becomes one of the hidden engines of early Egypt. The threat of the Nile is never far behind the gift. If the flood is poor, fields shrink and storage becomes critical. If the flood is extreme, houses, paths, and early fields can suffer. If channels shift, familiar ground changes. The river's unpredictability encourages people to think in terms of balance, a concept that later Egyptian civilization will raise into one of its deepest ideals, order against chaos. It would be too simple to say that flood control directly creates the pharaoh. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of Egyptian kingship, but it's equally difficult to imagine early Egyptian civilization without the repeated experience of a life-giving force that must be watched, interpreted, and socially managed. From this pressure grows a way of seeing the world. The valley is narrow, but the imagination expands around it. The black land and red land, the flood and the drought, the field and the desert, the marsh and the dry ridge, the settled village and the distant route, these oppositions become more than geography. They become patterns through which people understand existence. A ruler, when one finally appears at the center of the Egyptian state, will not merely own land. He will claim to preserve order between opposing forces. That claim will have force because generations before him have already lived the truth of those oppositions in their bodies and fields. So the Nile does not simply make Egypt rich, it makes Egypt think in rhythms. It teaches return, measurement, boundary, storage, movement, danger, renewal, and dependence. It creates a world in which memory is valuable and coordination can become sacred. Along its banks, the scattered communities of the Predynastic age learn to live with a river that is never still and never absent. And slowly, through countless seasons of rising water and darkening fields, the river prepares the valley for a new kind of power, one that will eventually claim to speak for the land itself. The river's importance becomes clearer when the land beyond it begins to change. To imagine Egypt before Egypt, the eye has to move away from the narrow valley and out across North Africa, into a Sahara that is not yet the Sahara of later memory. Earlier in the Holocene, much of that immense region is wetter than it will become. Seasonal rains reach farther north. Lakes fill basins that will later turn to dust, and grasslands spread where only wind and stone will remain. Animals move through these landscapes in numbers that seem almost impossible when seen against the modern desert antelope. Wild cattle, giraffes, predators following herds, birds gathering around water. Human groups move with them, not as strangers in a wasteland, but as people who know routes, water sources, seasonal returns, hunting grounds, grazing, and the delicate language of a landscape that changes from year to year. This greener Sahara is not a paradise, and it should not be romanticized. Rainfall varies, water can fail. But compared with the later desert, it offers possibilities that are difficult to recover from the dry bones of archaeology alone. Rock art across parts of North Africa preserves images of cattle, wild animals, boats, and human activity that suggest worlds of movement, herding, ritual, and observation. These images are not simple photographs of daily life, and scholars still debate their exact meanings and dates in many cases, yet they reveal something essential before the Nile Valley becomes the heart of a kingdom. The wider desert is already alive with memory, skill, and symbolic imagination. Then the balance begins to shift. The African humid period weakens in different ways across different regions. Rain belts move, lakes shrink, grasslands become patchier, the dependable places become fewer. The drying of the Sahara is not a single seasonal disaster, and the evidence remains incomplete when traced from valley to valley and basin to basin. Some communities remain in favoured areas for a long time. Others adjust their routes. Some turn more heavily toward herding. Some move toward oases, mountains, coasts, or river corridors. But in the broadest sense, the Nile becomes increasingly important because it offers what the wider landscape is losing a long, permanent line of water. The Nile does not merely support those who happen to live beside it. It draws in people, practices, animals, and ideas from a changing world. As surrounding regions become less predictable, the valley becomes a place where different traditions can meet. The movement may happen by households, herding groups, marriage ties, seasonal visits, trading contacts, or slow relocation over generations. No single migration explains the birth of Egyptian civilization. But what survives in the record suggests that the Nile's early society forms in conversation with the desert as much as with the river. The people who come toward the Nile do not arrive empty-handed. They bring knowledge of animals, especially cattle, sheep, and goats in some contexts. And they bring ways of living that have been tested in open landscapes. They know how to move across dry country, find water, read animal behavior, and treat the desert not simply as a barrier, but as a network of routes. Even after the kingdom forms, desert roads will carry gold, stone, incense, copper, shells, and foreign goods. The habit of looking beyond the valley begins long before royal expeditions carve official records into stone. Cattle may be one of the clearest signs of this wider world entering the Egyptian story. In later Egypt, cattle are wealth, offering, agricultural strength, and royal symbolism. In the Predynastic age, they already carry social weight. A herd is not merely a food supply. It represents mobility, status, and the ability to survive beyond the tight limits of fields. Horns, bulls, and powerful bovine imagery appear in ways that hint at older associations between animal strength and human authority. It would be too simple to draw a straight line from Saharan herders to pharaohs, but pastoral traditions help shape the symbolic language of early power. The desert also contributes a particular kind of imagination. A person living near the Nile sees the desert every day as a limit, a brightness, a danger, and a promise. It is where the sun rises over cliffs, where the dead may be placed in dry ground, where useful stone can be found, where rare minerals glitter, and where routes lead to distant peoples. In such a landscape, the desert becomes more than empty space. It becomes the outside of the ordered world, but also a source of power. Later Egyptian thought will often contrast the cultivated black land with the red land beyond, but that contrast grows out of practical experience much older than written theology. The drying Sahara may also help explain why social density increases along the Nile. When people concentrate in a narrower habitable zone, contacts intensify, competition for good land, grazing, water access, and trade routes can sharpen. So can cooperation. Shared risks encourage alliances, ceremonies, and exchange. People who might once have spread widely now live closer to riverbanks, flood basins, and marshes. With closeness comes friction, but also innovation. Pottery styles can spread faster. Ritual objects can travel farther. Leaders can gain influence over larger groups. Differences in wealth and status become more visible. This is not the story of one people replacing another in a simple wave. Ancient population history is far more layered than that, and modern genetic evidence must be handled carefully, especially when samples are rare and much later than the events being described. What can be said more safely is that northeastern Africa has long been a zone of contact, not isolation. The Nile links Africa to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Levant, and the deeper interior. The origins of Egypt belong to that connected world. Its earliest civilization is African, rooted in the Nile and surrounding deserts, while also open to exchanges of crops, animals, materials, and ideas across neighbouring regions. The surprising detail is that the desert, often imagined as Egypt's opposite, helps create Egypt. Without the drying lands around it, the Nile might not have drawn people and traditions together in the same way. Without desert routes, the valley might not have gained the materials and contacts that fed early elite display. Without the contrast between green floodplain and red wilderness, Egyptian ideas of order, boundary, danger, and sacred kingship might have taken a different shape. The emptiness around Egypt, in other words, is not empty in the story of its birth. By the late Predynastic period, the Nile is no longer just a river bordered by communities. It is becoming the central stage of a much wider transformation. The old green Sahara is fading into memory, but not disappearing without trace. Its animals survive in images. Its herding traditions echo in status and ritual. Its roots remain as arteries across the dry land. People shaped by its changing landscapes help fill the valley with skills that cannot be reduced to farming alone. Egypt begins not as a closed strip beside water, but as the meeting point between river and retreating grassland, between settlement and movement, between the dependable flood and the fading horizons beyond it. And as the desert tightens around the Nile, the valley becomes more crowded with possibility. They are still not a kingdom, but the ingredients of one are gathering food, animals, trade, symbols, rivalry, memory, and a geography that pushes life inward while opening roots outward. The river has already taught rhythm and order. The drying Sahara adds pressure, movement, and a deeper sense of boundary. Together, they prepare the ground for villages that will no longer remain only villages. The villages that grow along the floodplain do not announce the beginning of civilization with stone monuments or royal names. They appear first as quieter traces floors packed into earth, post holes, hearth ash, storage pits, animal bones, baskets gone except for impressions, and broken pottery scattered where people once cooked, carried, poured, and stored. It is tempting, from the distance of 5,000 years, to rush past these ordinary places on the way to kings and tombs. But Egypt's beginning depends on them. The state that rises around 3100 BC needs more than one victorious ruler. It needs households that know how to farm, craftspeople who can produce useful and beautiful things, exchange networks that can move goods, and communities willing, or pressured, to live within larger systems of obligation. Early farming communities in Egypt develop unevenly, and that unevenness matters. In the north, delta settlements are shaped by marshes, channels, wet soils, and contact with the Mediterranean and southwestern Asia. In Upper Egypt, settlements develop in a narrower valley, closer to desert routes and hard stone sources, where burial grounds on dry margins can preserve signs of social difference with unusual clarity. Archaeology often sees the dead better than the living because graves in desert cemeteries survive more easily than houses on the floodplain. This creates a distorted mirror. The people who built daily life are partly hidden, while the people who received carefully prepared burials often stand out. The evidence remains incomplete, but even through that distortion, a pattern emerges. Some communities begin to accumulate more goods, more specialized objects, and more visible status than others. The Badarian culture, earlier than the great rise of Naqada, offers a glimpse of this world before political complexity fully hardens. Its people farm, herd, hunt, and make fine pottery, including thin-walled vessels whose dark tops and polished surfaces show technical skill and aesthetic care. Some graves contain beads, ivory objects, palettes, and other items that suggest personal display and differences in wealth or identity. These are not royal burials. They do not yet belong to the world of pharaohs, but they show that long before the first dynasty, people in the Nile Valley are already using objects to mark meaning around the body, death, and social memory. A pot is not only a container, a bead is not only decoration, a grave is not only a place to put the dead. Each can become a way of saying who a person was, or who the living wish that person to be remembered as. As time passes into the Naqada periods, especially in Upper Egypt, the signs of increasing complexity become stronger. Pottery styles change, and some vessels become canvases for boats, animals, standards, and abstract designs. Graves grow more varied. Some remain modest, while others contain larger numbers of good stone vessels, cosmetic palettes, combs, beads, tools, and imported materials. This widening difference does not prove a kingdom by itself, but it suggests hierarchy. Some households or lineages have more access to labour, craft, exchange, and ritual display. The social landscape is becoming less flat. Everyday work supports this change. People cultivate emmer wheat and barley. They tend legumes where conditions allow. They use flax, an unglamorous but profoundly important plant, for fibres that can become linen. They herd cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs in varying local patterns. They fish, gather plants, collect reeds, and exploit wetlands. At sites such as Tel El Iswid in the eastern delta, archaeobotanical evidence reveals not only staple grains but also the practical complexity of plant use crops, pulses, weeds that mark cultivation, possible seasonality, marsh resources, and fuel choices including dung and plant byproducts. Such details may seem small, but they bring the ancient village back down to earth. Civilization is not first built from symbols. It is built from calories, fibers, fuel, containers, and repeated labor. There is a lesser-known kind of intelligence in this village world, the knowledge of materials. Clay has to be selected, tempered, shaped, dried, and fired. Stone must be found, struck, ground, polished, or drilled. Bone, horn, ivory, shell, and wood each behave differently under the hand. A craftsperson understands heat, pressure, moisture, abrasion, and fracture in ways that may never be written down. Over time, certain objects become more refined, cosmetic palettes, for example. Beginners practical grinding surfaces for pigments, but some later examples become large, ceremonial, and covered with imagery. Stone vessels require remarkable patience and skill. Beads of hard stone demand drilling techniques that speak to specialized craft knowledge. These objects are not merely signs of beauty, they're signs of time, labor, and social value. Villages also create the setting in which ritual becomes more formal. The dead are often placed in contracted positions, sometimes wrapped or accompanied by goods. Some burials are simple, others richer. Some include animal remains, ornaments, tools, or vessels. No one can fully reconstruct the beliefs behind each grave, and scholars still debate how much later Egyptian religion can be read backward into the Predynastic period. Caution is necessary. The people of these early villages do not leave theological books, but the careful treatment of the dead suggests that death already has a social and symbolic weight. The body, the objects, the grave location, and the surrounding cemetery all participate in a memory system older than kingship. One of the quiet transformations of the village world is the rise of storage. Storage changes time. A crop harvested in one season can feed people months later. Surplus can cushion risk, but it can also be controlled. Whoever manages stored goods may gain influence. At first, that management might be household-based or communal, tied to kinship and practical need. But as settlements grow and differences widen, stored food and craft goods can become instruments of obligation. People can be fed for work, specialists can be supported, ceremonies can be sponsored, leaders can give, withhold, redistribute, or display abundance. In later Egypt, the state will become a vast machine of collection and redistribution. In the villages, the principle begins on a smaller scale, close to the ground. Trade adds another layer, a village that can obtain shells, hard stone, copper, gold, ivory, or exotic materials from distant places participates in a world larger than itself. Some of these goods move through many hands before reaching their final users. Their value is not only practical, it lies partly in distance. A bead from far away carries a story even when no one writes it down. A rare stone in a grave says that the buried person, or the people burying them, had access to networks beyond the local field. This is where simple exchange begins to shade into prestige. A community that controls a route, a craft, or a desirable material can rise in importance. Yet village life is not only a march toward hierarchy. Most people remain tied to repetitive, necessary work. They plant and harvest, watch animals, repair tools, shape clay, gather fuel, cook food, and care for households. Their lives may not appear in royal monuments, but without them there is no early Egypt. The great danger in telling the origins of civilization is to let later kings steal the whole story. The first crowns rest on a foundation made by anonymous hands. The people who never appear by name are the ones who turn the floodplain into a livable human system. By the later Predynastic period, some villages are no longer merely villages in the older sense. They're connected to cemeteries with visible ranking, craft traditions with specialized production, trade networks with far-reaching contacts, and ritual symbols that speak across regions. They are places where leadership can become hereditary, where ceremonies can gather more people, where wealth can be displayed, and where local identity can be transformed into political ambition. The shift is gradual, but the consequences are immense. A settlement that controls people, food, goods, memory, and symbols begins to look towards something beyond itself. The Nile and the drying Sahara have already pushed life into concentration and rhythm. Now the villages give that larger pressure a human form. They create the daily habits from which authority can grow. They make surplus possible. They make inequality visible. They make memory durable in cemeteries and objects. They teach people to recognize certain materials, images, and ceremonies as special. And in a few places, these ordinary foundations begin to support extraordinary claims. Egypt is still not yet unified. No single king yet speaks for the two lands, but the floodplain has become crowded with experiments in power, and some of them are about to become much more dangerous, much more sacred, and much harder to resist. The first signs of Egypt's future voice appear before Egypt can truly write. They are not yet the long lines of hieroglyphs carved into temple walls, not yet royal decrees, offering formulas, king lists, or sacred names enclosed in the elegant frames of later dynasties. They appear instead on pottery, palettes, tags, vessels, and carved surfaces where image and meaning are still close to one another, where a mark may be decoration, ownership, ritual memory, clan identity, place name, divine sign, or political claim all at once. This is one of the most fascinating stages in the birth of Egyptian civilization, because it reveals a mind learning how to make power visible before words become fixed enough to speak across centuries. In the villages and growing towns of the Predynastic Nile Valley, objects carry more than use. A pot can store grain, beer, oil, or offerings, but it can also carry painted boats, animals, standards, and flowing designs that suggest movement across water or procession through ritual space. A cosmetic palette can grind green or black pigment for the body, but over time some palettes become larger, more elaborate, and less practical, turning into ceremonial surfaces where animals, enemies, rulers, and divine forces are arranged with increasing care. A mace head can be a weapon or emblem, but in elite contexts it can also become a concentrated symbol of authority. The practical object does not disappear, it is lifted into a second life. This matters because early Egypt does not invent kingship first and symbolism later. The two grow together. People learn to recognize authority through repeated forms: a raised arm, a powerful bull, a falcon, a boat, a standard, a bound captive, a defeated animal, a ruler larger than surrounding figures, a desert beast under control. These images slowly build a shared grammar of domination, protection, fertility, and order. No surviving manual explains this grammar for the Predynastic period. Scholars still debate the meaning of many motifs, and some may have shifted depending on place, object, and setting. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. A visual language is forming, and it is already doing political work. The animal world is especially important in this early imagery. Crocodiles, hippopotamuses, bulls, birds, lions, scorpions, antelope, dogs, and fantastic composite creatures appear across different objects and contexts. These animals are not simply illustrations of wildlife. They come from a landscape where human life depends on understanding power outside the village, the danger of the river, the strength of cattle, the speed of desert animals, the violence of predators, the mystery of birds that move between earth, water, and sky. Later Egyptian religion will give many animals divine associations, but the roots of that thinking seem older than written myth. What survives suggests a world in which animals help people imagine forces larger than themselves. Some images feel surprisingly close to later royal ideology. On decorated palettes and knife handles from the late Predynastic period, scenes of control and hierarchy become increasingly formal. Animals march in ordered rows. Human figures appear in arrangements that separate important bodies from lesser ones. Boats carry standards that may represent communities, cults, or powers whose exact identities remain uncertain. The image of an individual dominating an enemy or wild force becomes more pronounced. This does not mean that every such figure is already a pharaoh in the later sense, but it does mean that visual habits associated with Egyptian kingship are being rehearsed before the state fully takes shape. One of the lesser known but crucial developments is the use of marks that may identify places, commodities, institutions, or individuals before mature writing. On pottery and tags, signs appear that are not merely ornamental. Some may be pot marks, ownership marks, workshop marks, estate indicators, or early administrative signs. Their meaning is often difficult to prove because a mark without a sentence can be stubbornly silent. Still, their existence shows a growing need to label, distinguish, count, or connect objects to people and places. Once goods begin moving through wider networks, memory alone becomes less reliable. A mark on a jar can say something that a jar without a mark cannot. The road toward hieroglyphic writing is therefore not only intellectual, it is administrative and social. Writing does not emerge because someone suddenly wishes to compose literature. It emerges because a more complex world needs durable signs. Goods have to be stored, offerings identified, tomb equipment labelled, rulers named, and institutions remembered. In the late 4th millennium BC, as elite tombs become larger and power more centralized, tags and sealings begin to show combinations of signs that move closer to writing. These are small things compared with pyramids, but they are revolutionary. A marked label tied to goods can transform an object into information. A sign attached to a ruler's name can make authority portable. A seal impression can make control repeatable. The shape of early signs also reveals something about Egyptian thought. The later hieroglyphic system will remain intensely visual, full of birds, reeds, mouths, houses, hills, arms, waterlines, animals, tools, and divine emblems. It never fully abandons the image. Even when signs function phonetically, they still look like pieces of the world. This gives Egyptian writing a special character. It is not merely code, it is also display, art, theology, and order carved into visible form. The beginnings of that character lie in the predynastic habit of loading objects with symbolic force. The boundary between image and writing is difficult to draw sharply, and this uncertainty is part of the story. A falcon perched above a sign may suggest a ruler, a god, a place, or some combination of those meanings. A scorpion may be an animal, an emblem, a name, or a mark of power. A boat may represent travel, ritual procession, a community, or a journey into the unseen. The evidence remains incomplete, and the oldest signs often resist simple translation. But that resistance does not make them meaningless. It reminds us that early symbols lived in ceremonies, gestures, objects, and shared assumptions that archaeology can only partially recover. By the time political power begins to gather around major Upper Egyptian centres, this symbolic world has become dense enough to support royal claims. A ruler does not need to explain everything if the audience already understands the signs. A crown, a falcon, a smiting pose, a procession, a standard, a bull, a bound enemy, or a carefully ordered group of animals can speak with immediate force. The coming kings inherit a world already trained to see power through image. They will sharpen that language, monumentalize it, and eventually combine it with writing so that royal authority can be named, repeated, and remembered. This is why the period before full writing is not silent. It is only speaking in a form harder for modern eyes to hear. Its messages survive in curves of pottery, incised marks, carved animals, worn pigments, and ceremonial objects that seem to hover between tool and myth. They show a society learning how to turn memory into sign into authority, and authority into something that appears natural, even cosmic. The villages of the floodplain have already produced food, storage, craft, and inequality. Now they are producing a symbolic system powerful enough to make inequality visible and perhaps acceptable. The first hieroglyphs will not fall from the sky. They will rise from this older world of marks and images, from the need to remember goods, names, places, rituals, and rulers. Before Egypt writes its history, it learns to picture power. And once power can be pictured, it can travel farther than a voice, last longer than a ceremony, and begin the long transformation from local prestige into kingship. A symbol does not become powerful by itself. It needs a place where people gather, a community that recognizes it, and a social world where some voices begin to matter more than others. In the later Predynastic Nile Valley, that social world becomes most visible in a few rising centres of Upper Egypt, places that are not yet cities in the later monumental sense, but are already more than villages. Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos stand out like early flames along the river, each illuminating a different part of the transformation. Around them, wealth gathers, rituals grow more formal, craft production becomes more specialized, and leadership begins to harden into something that can command beyond the household. Naqada gives its name to an entire archaeological sequence because the changes seen there and across Upper Egypt are so important. The Naqada culture is not one simple thing, and it changes over time, but it marks a long movement from local farming communities toward a society capable of producing kings. Early in the sequence, burials and objects still belong to a world of regional identity and developing hierarchy. Later, the evidence points toward wider exchange, stronger elites, an imagery that grows increasingly political. Pottery styles spread. Grave goods become more elaborate in some cemeteries. Exotic materials appear. The valley is no longer a necklace of isolated settlements. It is becoming a competitive landscape. Competition does not always mean open war. It can mean control of trade, prestige in ritual, access to skilled craftspeople, command over labor, possession of rare objects, or the ability to host gatherings that bind people into obligation. A leader who sponsors a feast, organizes a burial, controls imported stone, or displays animal wealth can gain influence without leaving a battle scene behind. Archaeology rarely shows the full mechanism. It gives the consequences richer graves. Larger cemeteries, specialized production, objects that took more time than ordinary life required. What survives in the record suggests that power is becoming visible through accumulation, display, and ceremony. Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekon, is one of the most remarkable windows into this process. Long before it becomes known in later Egyptian tradition as a cult center of Horus, it is already a major predynastic center with settlement areas, cemeteries, craft zones, and ritual spaces. Its scale matters. Hierakonpolis suggests organization beyond a small village, with people engaged in brewing, pottery production, stoneworking, animal management, and ceremonial activity. The site gives a sense of a community where daily work and elite display are deeply connected. Beer, for example, is not only a drink. In early complex societies, large-scale brewing can support feasting, labor organization, ritual gatherings, and elite generosity. A vat can be political in a way that looks unimpressive until one remembers how people are gathered, fed, and bound together. At Hierakonpolis, some of the most striking evidence comes from elite cemeteries and ceremonial contexts. Tombs become larger, painted decoration appears, animals may be buried in ways that suggest unusual ritual or elite display, though scholars still debate the exact meanings of many such finds. The presence of powerful wild animals in elite settings hints at an ideology of control over dangerous forces. The ruler or high-status figure is not merely wealthy. He is associated with the ability to command what lies outside ordinary human order. This theme will later become central to Egyptian kingship, where the pharaoh is imagined as the force that holds chaos at bay. In the predynastic world, that idea is not yet fully written, but it is already being staged. Abydos offers another crucial piece of the puzzle. In later Egyptian memory, Abydos becomes one of the holiest places in the land, deeply linked to royal ancestors and the god Osiris. But its importance begins much earlier. The cemeteries at Abydos, especially in the region of el-Kab, preserve the growing grandeur of elite burials before and during the earliest dynasties. Here, the line between powerful local rulers and the first kings becomes difficult and fascinating. Tombs associated with late predynastic rulers show increasing complexity, and by the first dynasty, royal tombs become central statements of power, memory, and cosmic legitimacy. Abydos becomes a place where authority is not only exercised but buried, remembered, and made ancestral. This matters because kingship is never just a living office. It is also a relationship with the dead. A leader who can claim descent, continuity, or ritual connection to powerful ancestors has more than personal strength. He has depth. In a world without printed law codes or bureaucratic archives in the later sense, memory itself can become a political resource. Cemeteries are not passive landscapes. They are places where lineages are displayed, where social difference is made permanent, where the living return to the dead and perhaps see their own hierarchy reflected back at them. At Abydos, the dead begin to help build the state. The three centres do not rise in identical ways. Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos each have their own local histories, and scholars still debate how their relationships unfolded. Did one conquer the others? Did alliances form? Did religious prestige shift from one centre to another? Did economic control matter more than military force at certain moments? The evidence remains incomplete, and later Egyptian tradition tends to smooth messy beginnings into orderly royal memory. But the archaeological pattern suggests that Upper Egypt becomes increasingly integrated before political unification with the north is fully achieved. Local centres compete, merge, absorb, or overshadow one another until a more centralized authority becomes possible. One surprising detail in this process is how much power seems to depend on performance. The early ruler is not simply an administrator sitting over grain stores. He appears through ceremonies, processions, animal symbolism, feasting, burial display, and images of dominance. This is not empty theatre. In a society where writing is just emerging as institutions are still forming, repeated public acts help make power real. People must see authority, gather around it, participate in it, fear it, benefit from it, and remember it. Ritual is one of the technologies of early government. Craft specialists are another hidden foundation of this rising power. Fine pottery, carved ivory, stone vessels, palettes, beads, mace heads, and ceremonial objects require time and skill. Someone has to feed the makers, someone has to obtain the raw materials, someone has to decide where the finished objects go. As elites demand more elaborate goods for display, exchange, burial, and ritual, craft production becomes linked to hierarchy. Objects of beauty become evidence of command over labour. A finely made vessel is not only an artwork, it is a small monument to the social system that allowed it to exist. By the late Predynastic period, the valley is therefore moving toward a new scale of life. The old village foundations remain, but above them rise centres that gather food, goods, symbols, specialists, and followers. These places are not yet the Egypt of pyramids or vast temples, but they already contain the essential pattern, a sacred landscape, elite cemeteries, controlled imagery, long-distance exchange, and leaders who present themselves as more than successful local men. They are becoming mediators between community and cosmos, between river and desert, between the living and the dead. As these centres grow, the Nile Valley becomes more tightly woven and more unequal. The symbols discussed earlier now have stronger owners. The marks on objects begin to belong to institutions. The richest graves no longer speak only of personal status, but of political transformation. In Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, the future kingdom is learning how to concentrate itself. The river has made movement possible. The villages have made surplus possible. The symbols have made authority visible. Now the rising towns make power territorial, and once power attaches itself to territory, the question of who rules the whole valley can no longer remain quiet. Power in the early Nile Valley does not grow only from fields. It also grows from things that do not belong nearby. A stone vessel made from a hard, beautiful material says something different from a clay pot shaped beside the settlement. A shell carried from distant water carries more than ornament. Gold from desert places, ivory from southern roots, copper from far beyond ordinary village reach, lapis-like blue stones, obsidian, incense, fine timber, and unusual animal products all enter Egypt's early world with a kind of silent authority. Their value lies partly in usefulness, partly in beauty, and partly in the distance folded inside them. To possess such things is to possess a connection to somewhere else. In a society where status is becoming sharper, distance itself can become a form of power. The Nile makes some of this movement easier. As a river road, it allows goods to travel north and south with a regularity that overland routes cannot match. Heavy jars, food supplies, stone, animals, and people can move by boat, linking settlements that might otherwise remain separated by days of difficult travel. But the Nile is only one part of the network. The desert, which looks at first like a boundary, also functions as a web of pathways, wadis, oases, seasonal tracks. Unknown water sources guide movement east toward the Red Sea hills, west toward desert basins, south toward Nubia and beyond, and north toward the Delta and Mediterranean contacts. The world of early Egypt is narrow in its cultivated land, but wide in its connections. Desert stone is especially important. The floodplain gives clay, reeds, mud, and plant life. But many of the prestigious materials of early Egypt come from dry places. Hard stones for vessels, pallets, beads, and tools require knowledge of sources and routes. They require labour to quarry or collect, skill to shape, and organisation to transport. A finely polished stone vessel placed in an elite grave is therefore not only a container, it is the final visible point of a chain of action stretching from landscape knowledge to craft expertise to social privilege. The object seems still, but its history is full of movement. Gold carries an even stronger charge. In later Egypt, gold will become the flesh of the gods, the material of royal radiance, the metal that does not tarnish like ordinary things. In the Predynastic world, gold is already rare enough and striking enough to serve as an elite material. Its sources lie not in the green fields but in desert regions, especially toward the eastern deserts and Nubian zones. To obtain it, people need access to routes, labour, and knowledge of difficult terrain. The appearance of gold in early elite contexts suggests not only wealth, but the ability of certain groups to reach beyond the normal village economy. A leader who commands gold is, in a sense, already commanding the desert. Nubia and the lands to the south form one of the most important zones of interaction. The Nile does not stop at Egypt's later political border. It continues through cataracts, rocky passages, and communities with their own traditions, resources, and ambitions. Contact between Upper Egypt and Nubian regions is complex and changes over time. It can include exchange, imitation, rivalry, movement of people, and perhaps coercion in certain later contexts. In the Predynastic period, southern connections bring materials such as ivory, ebony-like woods, animal products, and ideas moving through longer African networks. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is clear that early Egypt's rise cannot be understood as a purely local event sealed inside the valley. To the northeast, another world presses close. The delta opens toward the Levant, Sinai, and Mediterranean routes. Contacts with southwestern Asia appear in crops, animals, objects, and certain influences, though scholars still debate the exact direction, timing, and meaning of many exchanges. Egypt does not simply borrow civilization from outside, as older and outdated models sometimes implied. The Nile Valley has its own deep African foundations and its own trajectory of social complexity. But neither is it isolated. Foreign materials and ideas move into Egyptian contexts, where they are adapted, transformed, and made Egyptian. The beginning of Egypt is best seen not as imitation, but as selective absorption within a strong local world. This distinction matters. When a foreign object appears in a grave, it does not automatically mean foreign rule, mass migration, or cultural dependence. It may mean trade, it may mean gift exchange, it may mean prestige copying, it may mean that an elite wants to display access to something rare. It may mean that artisans are experimenting with forms that travelled from elsewhere. Archaeology often sees the object without the conversation that carried it. No single explanation fully accounts for every contact, but the repeated presence of non-local materials shows that early Egyptian elites understand the political value of connection. Trade is not always a marketplace in the modern sense. In early societies, valuable goods often move through relationships, kinship, marriage, diplomacy, ritual exchange, obligation, seasonal encounter, or elite gift-giving. A rare object may bind two communities. A shipment of stone may depend on protection along a route. A bead may pass through several hands before entering a grave far from its source. The goods move, but so do stories, techniques, gestures, and reputations. A leader who can obtain distant things may appear favoured, capable, dangerous, or sacred. The social meaning of exchange can matter as much as the material itself. The desert routes also require specialists of a sort. Someone must know where water can be found, which tracks are passable, when heat becomes deadly, where stone sources lie, and how to move animals and loads across exposed ground. This knowledge may belong to herders, desert travellers, hunters, miners, or groups whose lives are only partly visible from settled village sites. The state that later sends expeditions into mines and quarries inherits a much older tradition of desert expertise. Long before official inscriptions praise royal missions, unnamed travellers are learning the paths that make those missions possible. In elite burials, distant goods help create a theatre of inequality. A body accompanied by rare stone, ivory, copper, gold, shells, and finely made objects is not being remembered in the same way as a body buried with little. These differences do not tell us everything about social rank, and burial customs can express ritual choices as well as wealth. But the pattern is difficult to ignore. Some people have access to wider worlds than others, even in death. Their graves become maps of connection. The dead carry the river, the desert, the south, the north, and the distant horizon into the cemetery with them. There is also a political danger in trade. Networks that bring wealth can also bring rivalry. If one center controls a route, another may try to bypass it. If one elite lineage gains access to a rare material, others may seek their own sources. If objects from afar become symbols of legitimacy, the struggle to obtain them becomes more intense. Trade feeds display. Display feeds competition, and competition feeds the growth of stronger leadership. The rising centers of Upper Egypt are not merely rich because they sit by the Nile. They are rich because they learn to reach outward, then turn what they acquire into signs of inward authority. By the late Predynastic period, the emerging political landscape of Egypt is therefore threaded with movement. Boats pass along the river. Desert paths carry stone, metal, shells, and animals. Southern routes bring African materials and contacts. Northeastern routes bring Levantine links and unfamiliar forms. Local craftspeople transform imported materials into objects that speak the language of Egyptian status. What began as exchange becomes part of state formation, The future king will not rule only fields and villages. He will claim command over roads, quarries, deserts, borders, and the distant places from which prestige flows. The earlier towns have made power territorial. Trade now makes it expansive. It teaches ambitious leaders that authority can be measured not only by how many people live near them, but by how far their reach extends. Egypt's first rulers will inherit a valley already connected to lands beyond itself, and that inheritance will shape the very idea of kingship. To rule Egypt is to hold the black land beside the river, but also to face the red land, the southern routes, the northern marshes, the eastern deserts and the horizons where rare things come from. When power begins to reach beyond the village, it has to explain itself. Food can support followers, trade can bring rare materials, burial can preserve memory, symbols can make authority visible. But a ruler who wants to command more than his immediate community must do something harder. He must make other people accept that his power is not merely personal ambition. In the late Predynastic Nile Valley, this is where conflict and ceremony begin to twist together. The first rulers of Egypt do not rise in a peaceful, empty landscape. And they do not rise only as warriors. They appear in a world where force, ritual, prestige, and sacred imagery are becoming parts of the same political language. The evidence for conflict in this period is powerful but difficult to read. Archaeology finds weapons, defensive possibilities, scenes of domination, bound figures, animals under control, and elite objects that celebrate victory. It also finds settlement growth, regional competition, and changes in burial wealth that suggest pressure between communities. But the evidence remains incomplete, and it cannot always tell us whether a scene represents a real battle, a ritualized performance, a mythic image, or a political claim made after the fact. Early Egypt's visual language often turns human struggle into symbolic order. A defeated figure may stand for a rival, a foreigner, a rebel, a chaotic force, or all of these at once. This ambiguity is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of how early kingship works. A ruler does not need every image to be a literal report. He needs the image to say that disorder has been mastered. In the centuries before and around unification, elite objects increasingly show a world divided between the one who commands and the many who submit. The important figure is larger, calmer, and more controlled. Others are smaller, bound, arranged, or shown as part of a defeated mass. Animals may be ordered into rows, hunted, restrained, or made to frame scenes of authority. The message is not simply that one man is strong. The message is that the world becomes orderly around him. Mace heads are among the most revealing objects in this transformation. A mace begins as a weapon, a heavy head fixed to a handle, useful in close combat. But in elite pre-dynastic and early dynastic contexts, large decorated mace heads become symbols rather than practical tools. Their size, material, and imagery turn them into ceremonial statements. A weapon has been lifted out of ordinary fighting and made into an emblem of rule. This shift is crucial. The ruler's violence is no longer presented as uncontrolled aggression. It is displayed as sacred force, directed force, force that protects order and punishes chaos. That idea will echo through Egyptian kingship for thousands of years. The same transformation can be seen in the famous smiting pose, which becomes one of the longest-lived images in Egyptian royal art. The ruler raises his arm over a kneeling or subdued enemy. The scene is stark, repetitive, and deliberately formal. Its roots lie deep in the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic world. where leadership is increasingly shown through domination over enemies or dangerous beings. Later temple walls will repeat this motif so often that it almost becomes a royal signature. But in its early setting, it is still fresh, still connected to the birth of a political idea. The ruler is the person who defeats what threatens the land. This does not mean early Egypt is founded by violence alone. No single explanation fully accounts for state formation. Warfare may have mattered, but so did marriage alliances, trade, ritual authority, control of resources, administration, population movement, and the prestige of certain centers. Some regions may have been absorbed gradually. Some rival leaders may have been defeated. Some communities may have joined a larger order because it brought advantage, protection, access to goods, or participation in powerful ceremonies. The image of conquest is real in the symbolism, but the historical process behind it was likely more layered than a simple march of armies. Ritual helps bridge that gap. Ceremony can turn political expansion into cosmic necessity. A leader who merely takes land is a conqueror. A leader who performs the right rituals, receives the right symbols, appears beneath the right divine animal, and buries his dead in the right ancestral place becomes something more durable. He becomes the focus of a world that claims to make sense. In the late Predynastic Nile Valley, power is increasingly staged through gatherings, processions, offerings, feasts, animal displays, and decorated objects. People see authority enacted before they see it written. Feasting may seem modest compared with war, but it can be just as political. Large gatherings require food, drink, vessels, animals, labor, and planning. A leader who can provide abundance shows that he controls resources. A ceremony that feeds people also binds them. It creates memory, obligation, and hierarchy in a form that feels communal. Brewing, butchery, serving, music, procession, and offering may all belong to the same field of power. The person at the center does not only command, he gives, displays, blesses, and organizes. In return, others acknowledge his position, sometimes willingly, sometimes because the social pressure leaves little room outside the system. Animals intensify the ritual world of early rulers. Bulls suggest physical strength and reproductive force. Lions and wild predators suggest dangerous power. Falcons, later so closely associated with Horus and kingship, connect the ruler with height, speed, vision, and the sky. Scorpions, crocodiles, and other creatures may appear as emblems of fear, protection, locality, or personal identity. Scholars still debate the meanings of many early animal symbols, especially when they appear before later religious texts can explain them. But the general pattern is clear: animals help early elites speak about power in a way human language alone has not yet fixed. The desert also enters this royal imagination. Many scenes of control seem to oppose the settled, ordered world to forces from outside wild animals, foreign enemies, unruly lands, dangerous margins. The ruler's role is to stand at the boundary and force the dangerous outside into submission. This idea fits the geography of the Nile Valley with unusual precision. The black land is narrow and fertile. The red land surrounds it. The river renews life but also threatens disorder through flood and famine. In such a world, kingship can present itself as the power that keeps boundaries meaningful. Prestige objects make these claims portable. A carved knife handle, a ceremonial palette, a mace head, a seal impression, or an ivory tag can carry an image of authority from one setting to another. These objects may have been used in ceremonies, placed in tombs, exchanged among elites, or preserved as treasures. Their exact journeys are often unknown, but they show that power is being condensed into things. A community does not need to witness every act of rule if it recognizes the objects and signs associated with rule. The symbol becomes a substitute for presence. By the time early kings appear more clearly in the archaeological record, they inherit this fused language of force and ritual. They can claim to conquer because conquest has a visual grammar. They can claim to protect order because order has already been imagined against chaos. They can claim sacred authority because animals, standards, ancestors, and ceremonies have prepared the mind to see leadership as more than administration. The first kings are not inventing power from nothing. They're gathering older elements and arranging them into a sharper form. This is the world just before unification becomes visible. Upper Egyptian centers have grown ambitious. Trade has widened their reach. Symbols have learned to carry authority. Ritual has made hierarchy feel ancient even when it is new. Conflict, whether actual, remembered, exaggerated, or ceremonial, gives early rulers a dramatic language for expansion. And in that language, the future pharaoh begins to take shape, not yet the pyramid builder, not yet the god-king of later temples, but already the figure who stands between river and desert, village and kingdom, human violence and cosmic order. The closer the story comes to 3100 BC, the more tempting it becomes to imagine a single decisive moment. One ruler, one campaign, one victory, one day when Egypt becomes Egypt. Later memory encourages that temptation. So do famous objects, royal names, and the clean lines of historical timelines. They make unification look like a door opening. Before it, there are scattered cultures and competing regions. After it, there is a kingdom. But archaeology rarely grants beginnings so neatly. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt is one of the great turning points in ancient history, and also one of its most difficult mysteries, because it seems both sudden and gradual at the same time. The traditional image is powerful. Upper Egypt, the southern Nile Valley, rises under ambitious rulers. Those rulers expand northward, overcome rivals, and bring the delta into a single political order. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, are joined beneath one crown. A king stands at the center, and the long dynastic story begins. There is truth in this picture, but it is not the whole truth. What survives in the record suggests a process built from many overlapping changes: regional expansion, cultural influence, elite competition, trade, administrative development, symbolic integration, and probably episodes of violence. No single explanation fully accounts for it. Upper Egypt appears to play the leading role in the final stages. The archaeological spread of Naqada culture into northern regions shows that southern styles, objects, and perhaps institutions gain remarkable reach before the first dynasty. Pottery, burial practices, elite goods, and administrative habits suggest that Upper Egyptian influence moves northward over time. Yet influence is not the same as conquest in every place. Some communities may adopt southern styles because they are connected to powerful networks. Others may be absorbed through political pressure. Some may be ruled directly. Others may change gradually as elites imitate the successful symbols of the south. The evidence remains incomplete, especially in the delta, where preservation is more difficult because of water, silt, later settlement, and farming. The delta itself must not be treated as a blank space waiting to be conquered. It has its own communities, its own ecological world, and its own importance. The northern landscape is made of branches of the Nile, marshlands, fertile basins, and routes toward the Levant and the Mediterranean. Its settlements are harder for archaeology to recover, but they matter deeply. Lower Egypt offers access to foreign contacts, agricultural wealth, wetland resources, and strategic openings beyond the valley. To control the delta is not merely to add territory, it is to control the river's final transformation into a wide northern world. This is why the phrase two lands carries such weight. It is not just poetic geography. Upper and Lower Egypt are different environments, different historical zones, and different symbolic halves of a larger order. Later kings will wear the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, either separately or combined, turning political unity into a visible theology of rule. But before that symbolism becomes stable, someone has to make unity believable. The early state must convince people that the narrow southern valley and the marshy northern delta belong to one cosmic and political system. How this happens remains debated. Some scholars emphasize warfare and conquest, pointing to scenes of smiting, bound enemies, fortified settlements in some contexts, and the aggressive language of early royal art. Others stress economic integration, the spread of administrative practices, and the ability of southern elites to control trade routes and resources. Still others focus on ideology, the idea that ritual kingship, divine symbolism, and ceremonies of order help bind regions together in the imagination before bureaucracy fully binds them in practice. The most likely answer is not one of these alone. Egypt's unification probably emerges from the interaction of all three: force, management, and belief. The timing is also complex. Around 3100 BC is a useful landmark, but it is not a magic switch. Radiocarbon studies have refined the chronology of early Egypt and suggest that the transition from late predynastic chiefdoms to dynastic kingship may have unfolded over a relatively short span, perhaps faster than earlier generations of scholars imagined. But fast in archaeological terms can still mean several generations of human life. For the people living through it, change may have felt uneven. A northern village might experience new pottery styles, unfamiliar seals, southern officials, changing burial customs, or new obligations long before it understood itself as part of a unified kingdom. A southern elite centre might see unity as destiny, while a local community sees only new demands. The rulers who stand just before the first dynasty remain shadowy. Names such as Scorpion, Erihor, Ka, and Narmer hover at the edge of history, preserved on labels, seal impressions, vessels, tomb evidence, and later interpretation. They're not all equally secure in every detail, and their sequence has been debated. Yet they reveal something extraordinary. Kingship is already becoming nameable. Authority is no longer only shown through a generic, powerful figure. It is attached to individual rulers whose marks can travel on objects and whose burials can anchor memory. This is a decisive step. Once power has names, it can be recorded, repeated, inherited, and argued over. Abydos becomes especially important in this threshold world. The royal cemetery at el-Kab preserves the movement from late predynastic elite tombs into the first dynasty royal burials. Here, kingship gathers itself around death, ancestry, and place. A ruler's tomb is not simply a grave. It is a political monument, a storehouse of offerings, a sacred focus, and a statement that the king's authority continues beyond his living body. The early state is already learning one of Egypt's most enduring lessons: rule must be anchored in eternity, or at least in the appearance of it. Unification also requires administration. It is not enough to win a battle or hold a ceremony. Goods must move. Officials must know what belongs to whom. Offerings must be collected. Labour must be organised. Royal names must identify estates, jars, deliveries, and tomb equipment. Seal impressions and early writing become crucial because they let power operate at a distance. A king cannot stand in every granary, workshop, boat landing, and cemetery, but his name, seal, and agents can. In this sense, the unification of Egypt is not only a political event, it is the creation of a system that makes distance governable. What makes the mystery so enduring is that the earliest evidence is both dramatic and partial. The objects that survive are often elite, ceremonial, or funerary. They show how rulers wanted power to be seen, not necessarily how power was negotiated in every village. They emphasize victory, order, and divine authority, because that is what early kingship needs to emphasize. Beneath those images must lie messier realities, local compromise, resistance, adaptation, alliance, marriage, practical administration, and the slow replacement of older loyalties with royal ones. Later, Egypt remembers unity as order. Archaeology hints that order had to be made from many unsettled pieces. By around 3100 BC, the threshold has been crossed. The valley and delta are not yet the Egypt of the Old Kingdom, not yet the land of pyramids and vast stone temples, but something new has appeared. A ruler can claim the two lands. Administrative signs can carry royal authority. Elite tombs can anchor dynastic memory. Symbols of north and south can be brought together into one political imagination. The unification of Egypt is therefore not best understood as a single spark, nor as a slow drift without drama. It is a tightening, a long gathering of communities, resources, images, rituals, and rival powers suddenly becomes firm enough to call itself a kingdom. And once that happens, the story changes forever. The river that once linked villages now carries the commands of kings. The symbols that once floated between ritual and identity now become royal ideology. The graves that once marked status now become dynastic monuments. Egypt has not yet built its most famous wonders, but it has created the thing that will make them possible, a unified state with a sacred center. The mystery is not simply how Egypt was joined. It is how so many older forces learned to speak with one voice. Near the threshold of Egypt's beginning, one object seems to gather the whole transformation onto a single surface of stone. The Narmer palette is not large enough to be a monument in the later Egyptian sense. Yet it feels monumental because of what it compresses. It is a ceremonial palette, shaped from dark stone, carved on both sides, and found at Hierakonpolis, a place already heavy with predynastic power. At first glance, it appears to show victory. A king dominates enemies, wears crowns, marches before standards, and stands above signs that seem to name him. But the longer one looks, the less it behaves like a simple record of one event. It becomes a carefully arranged statement about what kingship is supposed to mean. Egypt has crossed into history, and already history is being shaped into royal image. Narmer stands at the center of this image world. His name appears through early hieroglyphic signs, often understood as a catfish and a chisel, enclosed in a palace facade frame known as a serek. That frame is more than a label. It links the ruler's name to the idea of a royal house, a seat of authority, an institution that can survive beyond a single body. Here, writing and kingship meet in one of their earliest powerful forms. The king is not only shown, he is named. His authority is not only seen, it is made repeatable. A sign can now carry the king where his body is absent. On one side of the palette, Narmer wears the tall white crown associated with Upper Egypt. He raises a mace over a kneeling enemy in the smiting pose that will become one of the most durable images in Egyptian royal art. Above the captive, a falcon, often associated with the god Horus, appears to control or present a symbol linked to subdued land or people. The scene does not need much motion. Its power lies in stillness. The king's body is large, balanced, and inevitable. The enemy is smaller and vulnerable. The falcon confirms that this is not only human violence, it is violence translated into sacred order. On the other side, Narmer appears wearing the red crown associated with Lower Egypt, moving in procession before standards and bodies arranged as defeated enemies. Below him, two long-necked creatures, often called serpopards by modern scholars, twist together while handlers restrain them. At the bottom, a bull attacks a fortified enclosure or enemy figure, another image of raw strength breaking through resistance. Every part of the palette seems designed to say that separation has been overcome, wildness has been controlled, and the king is the point where all forces meet, upper and lower, human and divine, violence and ritual, animal strength and political order all converge. It would be easy to say that the Narmer palette records the exact conquest of Lower Egypt by an Upper Egyptian king. For a long time, it has been treated as one of the great images of unification. That interpretation still has force, because the crowns, enemies, procession, and royal scale all point toward the joining of the two lands. But scholars still debate how literally it should be read. The palette may refer to a specific victory, a ritual of unification, a royal ceremony, an idealized political claim, or a combination of these. It might commemorate an event, but it also constructs an ideology. What survives in the record suggests not merely what happened, but what the early kings wanted people to believe had happened. This distinction is crucial. A royal image is never neutral. It selects, arranges, enlarges, and silences. The Narmer palette does not show negotiations, grain stores, marriage ties, local compromises, delta communities adapting to southern rule, or the administrative labour needed to hold a kingdom together. It shows the king making order through domination. That does not make it false, it makes it royal. The palette reveals the official imagination of the new state more clearly than it reveals the full complexity of unification. It is both evidence and argument. Its setting also matters. The palette was found among ceremonial deposits at Hierakonpolis, not lying casually in a house or field. It belongs to a ritual world in which decorated objects are gathered, displayed, dedicated, and remembered. Cosmetic palettes originally have practical functions connected to grinding pigments, but the Narmer palette is far beyond ordinary use. It is too elaborate, too charged, too political. The old tool has become a sacred surface. This transformation echoes the wider transformation of Egypt itself. Useful things become symbolic things. Local authority becomes sacred kingship. A river society becomes a state. One of the most surprising details is how many later Egyptian ideas are already present. The king appears larger than others. He wears crowns that define geography as political theology. He is associated with Horus. He smites an enemy. He is followed by attendants and standards. Defeated bodies are arranged as signs of restored order. Animals express royal force. The palace facade encloses the royal name. These forms will echo for centuries and then millennia. Later, Egypt will become astonishingly conservative in its royal imagery. But the Narmer palette shows that this conservatism is already anchored at the very beginning. The first image is not crude, it is sophisticated, disciplined, and ideologically dense. Yet there is mystery in what it does not explain. Who exactly are the enemies? Are they northerners, rebels, foreigners, symbolic representatives of chaos, or specific defeated communities? What ceremony required the palette who saw it? Was it made soon after the events it evokes, or as part of a ritual memory already taking shape? How widely would ordinary people have understood its details? The evidence remains incomplete. The palette speaks loudly, but not transparently. It gives the face of early kingship without giving the voices of those gathered beneath it. Narmer himself stands at the edge between archaeology and later tradition. He is often identified with the first ruler of a unified Egypt, and in some reconstructions he is linked with the legendary Menes, the founder remembered by later Egyptians and Greek writers. But the relationship between Narmer, Menes, and early dynastic tradition is still debated. Later king lists simplify the past, and royal memory has its own reasons for smoothing beginnings into a line of named rulers. Narmer is real in the archaeological record. Menes is more difficult, partly historical memory and partly foundation figure. The overlap between them remains one of the classic puzzles of Egypt's first dynasty. What matters most is that Narmer appears at a moment when kingship has become visible, named, and symbolically complete enough to endure. The palette does not create Egypt by itself, but it shows a state learning to present itself as eternal from the start. A political process that may have been messy and recent is carved as if it reflects the structure of the universe. That is the genius of early Egyptian kingship. It turns history into order before anyone can remember it otherwise. In the dark stone of the palette, Egypt sees itself as one land under one ruler. The river, the desert, the animals, the enemies, the crowns, the gods, and the name of the king all enter a single visual system. The image is not merely about Narmer. It is about the invention of a royal lens through which Egypt will look at itself for the rest of its ancient life. After this, the king is no longer simply the strongest figure among rival powers. He is the one who makes the two lands visible as a single world. Once Narmer's world is carved into stone, kingship in Egypt is no longer only a matter of control, it becomes a way of explaining existence. The earliest rulers of unified Egypt do not yet live in the age of pyramids, and the word pharaoh itself belongs more properly to later usage, when the royal house gives its name to the person of the king, but the essential idea is already forming at the beginning. The ruler is not simply a strong man who commands labour and collects goods. He is the figure through whom the land becomes ordered, the flood becomes meaningful, enemies become chaos, and political unity becomes part of the structure of the cosmos. Egypt's first kings inherit a valley of farms, towns, cemeteries, trade routes, and symbols, but they transform those things into something more enduring sacred kingship. This sacred kingship grows naturally from the geography that shaped Egypt from the beginning. The Nile floods and withdraws. The Black Land and Red Land face one another across a hard boundary. The delta and valley differ, but must be held together. The desert surrounds the settled world with danger and resources. The dead are buried in dry ground near the living fields. The sun rises and sets with a reliability that feels cosmic, while the river renews life from a source far beyond ordinary sight. In such a world, order is not an abstract idea. It is the condition of survival. The king becomes the human form of that order. Later Egyptians will call this ideal Ma'at truth, balance, rightness, justice, cosmic harmony. the proper arrangement of things. In the earliest dynastic period, the full theological language is still developing, and scholars still debate how far later concepts can be projected backward into the first dynasty. But the foundations are visible. Royal imagery presents the king as the one who defeats disorder, performs ritual, maintains boundaries, and unites opposites. He's not merely victorious over enemies, he is necessary because enemies, wild animals, desert forces, poor floods, and social fragmentation all belong to a larger category of threat. The ruler's task is to make the world hold together. This is why crowns matter so much. A crown is not only decoration. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt turn geography into sacred costume. When the king wears them, separately or in combination, he embodies the two lands. He becomes the place where north and south meet without dissolving into conflict. The crowns say that unity is not just administrative. It is visible, ritual, and almost bodily. The king carries the land on his head. The falcon also deepens the meaning of rule. The early king is closely associated with Horus, the sky falcon, whose image appears above the royal name in the Serek. A falcon sees from above. It moves between earth and sky. It strikes with speed and precision. By linking the king with Horus, early Egyptian ideology places kingship under a divine sign without making it merely human leadership blessed from outside. The ruler appears as the earthly focus of a heavenly power. His name sits beneath the falcon as if the palace itself is watched, protected, and charged by the sky. The Serek is one of the most important inventions of this early royal world. It frames the king's name within a stylized palace facade, suggesting that royal identity belongs to an institution, not only a person. A name written in a Serek is portable kingship. It can be impressed on clay, carved on vessels, attached to goods, placed in tombs, and sent across distance. It makes the king present where he is absent, in a land now stretching from southern centres to northern marshes. That matters enormously. Sacred kingship must be seen, but it must also be administered. The king's body becomes a political and ritual instrument. His appearance in art is controlled. He is larger than others, more stable, more composed. He performs gestures that are repeated for centuries, smiting, striding, grasping enemies, standing before standards, wearing crowns, presenting offerings. These repeated forms create a royal body that is more than anatomy. It is an image of permanent function. Individual kings die, but the pose of kingship continues. That continuity is one of Egypt's most powerful achievements. It makes rule appear older than any ruler. The early king also stands between the living and the dead. At Abydos, royal tombs become centres of memory and power. A king's death does not simply end his authority, it transforms it. The royal burial gathers goods, servants of the state, offerings, symbols, an ancestral presence into a landscape that later generations can recognize as sacred. The evidence for early beliefs remains incomplete, and one must be careful not to read the elaborate afterlife religion of later Egypt directly into every early tomb. Yet the scale and care of royal burials show that kingship already reaches beyond ordinary death. The ruler is not treated as a person who vanishes. He becomes part of a continuing order. This has practical consequences. A sacred king can demand labour in ways a local strongman cannot. Building tombs, producing offerings, carving vessels, brewing beer, making labels, transporting goods, maintaining estates, and organising ceremonies all become parts of a royal system. People work not only for a living leader, but for the institution of kingship, for the dead king, for the next king, and for the cosmic order the king claims to maintain. This is where belief and administration become inseparable. The sacred does not float above politics, it helps politics function. Yet early sacred kingship is not pure invention imposed from above. It draws on older village and predynastic habits, respect for ancestors, animal symbolism, burial display, ritual feasting, seasonal rhythms, desert danger, and the long experience of depending on the Nile. The genius of the early state is that it gathers these familiar elements and places the king at their centre. What once belonged to many local traditions becomes concentrated in one royal ideology. The king becomes herder, warrior, ritualist, ancestor, administrator, and cosmic mediator all at once. There is danger in believing royal images too completely. The king's monuments show order because that is what kingship wants to show. They rarely reveal uncertainty, resistance, negotiation, or ordinary suffering. They do not show the full complexity of local communities adjusting to central rule. The evidence remains incomplete, and much of what survives comes from elite contexts designed to glorify power. But even with that caution, the pattern is clear. Around the beginning of dynastic Egypt, kingship is becoming sacred in a way that will define the civilization for millennia. From this point onward, Egypt's ruler is not only the master of land, he is the keeper of balance. He is the one who receives the signs of north and south, stands under the falcon, acts against chaos, feeds the gods, honors the ancestors, commands the river's labor, and makes the unity of Egypt visible. The title and theology will change over centuries. The monuments will grow. The gods will become more elaborately named. The rituals will deepen. But the core idea is already present near the beginning. Egypt survives because order survives, and order has a royal face. The civilization that began in villages, flood mud, desert roots, and burial grounds now has a centre powerful enough to appear eternal. Sacred kingship does not erase the human realities beneath it. Farmers still farm, craftspeople still carve, boats still move, officials still count. But above those daily acts, a new image rises the king as the living hinge between earth and sky, between the Nile's returning waters and the dangerous world beyond the fields. Egypt has found not just a ruler, but a way to turn rule into meaning. The first government of Egypt does not appear as a building, it appears as a mark. A small sign pressed into wet clay, a label tied to a jar, a name written beside goods for a tomb, a ceiling broken when a container is opened. These are not dramatic objects in the way a carved palette is dramatic. They do not have the immediate force of a king raising a mace or a falcon claiming the sky above a royal name. Yet they may be among the most revolutionary inventions of early Egypt, because they allow authority to travel quietly. A ruler can be seen in ceremony only by those who stand before him, but a seal, a label, or a written sign can carry command into storehouses, workshops, boats, estates, and tombs. It can make power repeatable. This is the point where kingship begins to become government. Sacred authority may explain why the king should rule, but administration makes his rule practical. Grain must be gathered. Oil, beer, linen, cattle, and tools must be counted or identified. Offerings for royal tombs must be prepared and delivered. Craftspeople must be supplied. Labour must be organised for building, brewing, quarrying, transporting, and burial. A kingdom that stretches along the Nile cannot depend only on face-to-face memory. It needs signs that can outlast speech and travel farther than the person who gave the order. Early writing in Egypt grows out of this world of control and memory. It is not born as poetry, myth, or philosophical reflection. At its beginning, it is close to property, delivery, identity, and ritual obligation. This does not make it crude. It makes it urgent, a jar that holds oil from a particular place, a piece of tomb equipment made for a particular ruler, or a shipment connected to a royal estate becomes more useful when it can be marked. The sign makes the object part of a system. Without the sign, a jar is only a jar. With the sign, it may become royal property, tribute, offering, evidence of delivery, or a fragment of political geography. At Abydos, especially in late predynastic and early dynastic tomb contexts, small labels and inscriptions show this transformation in miniature. Some of the earliest writing appears on bone or ivory tags, pottery, sealings, and vessel marks associated with elite and royal burials. The marks can include animals, plants, buildings, numbers, place signs, and royal names. Their meaning is not always easy to read, and scholars still debate how fully phonetic or administrative some early signs are. The evidence remains incomplete, and many marks stand alone without the surrounding sentences that would make their meaning clearer. But the direction is unmistakable. The world is being sorted into signs. The tomb is a powerful engine in this process. A royal burial requires goods from many sources: food, drink, vessels, textiles, tools, ornaments, and materials from distant routes. To assemble them is an act of administration as much as devotion. The dead king must be supplied, and the living officials must know what has been supplied. Labels may identify contents, origins, quantities, or associations with estates and rulers. The afterlife, in this early form, becomes one of the reasons record-keeping expands. Eternity needs inventory. Seal impressions reveal another layer. A seal can be rolled or pressed into clay to close a jar, basket, door, or container. When the sealing is intact, it shows control has not been broken. When it is broken, it shows access has occurred. The image on the seal may carry a royal name, an official sign, a building, an animal, or an institutional mark. This simple technology turns clay into authority. It allows officials to manage goods without standing guard over every object. It creates a visible boundary between permitted and unauthorized access. A lump of clay becomes a statement this belongs within an ordered system. The development of the Serek deepens that system. The royal name, framed by the palace facade and often watched over by the Horus falcon, can appear on ceilings and objects far from the king's physical presence. This is the extension of sacred identity into administration. The palace, the god, the ruler, and the goods become linked. When a jar bears the king's name, it is not just labelled, it is drawn into the royal world. Administration also changes space. Once places can be named, marked, or associated with estates, Egypt becomes governable as a network. Fields, workshops, storehouses, and production centres can be tied to royal institutions. The king's reach no longer depends only on personal loyalty or immediate force. It becomes embedded in deliveries, seals, accounts, and recurring obligations. This is one of the less visible but decisive steps in state formation. The kingdom exists not only because people believe in the king, but because goods move as if the king's order is real. There is a surprising humility to the evidence. The birth of one of history's most famous civilizations can be seen in tags small enough to hold in a hand. Later Egypt will cover temple walls with carved inscriptions, fill tombs with texts, and create an enormous written culture of ritual, administration, literature, medicine, mathematics, and memory. But near the beginning, writing is often cramped, practical, and attached to things. It clings to jars, boxes, seals, tomb goods, and names. The first words of the state are not grand speeches, they are labels. Yet those labels carry profound consequences. Writing creates continuity. An official can die, but the practice remains. A delivery can be checked. A royal name can be repeated after the king's body is gone. A place can be remembered by an institution that outlives its local witnesses. This changes the scale of human organization. Oral memory is powerful, but it depends on living chains. Writing can sit in a storeroom, dry in the desert, be buried in a tomb, and still speak after the voices around it have vanished. The earliest Egyptian script remains tied to image, and this gives administration a symbolic weight. A sign can be both picture and sound, object and idea. A bird may be a bird, a sound, a divine hint, or part of a name. A house sign can point to a building, an estate, or an institution. A plant can evoke region, offering, or phonetic value depending on context. This flexibility allows writing to grow within Egypt's existing visual world rather than replace it. The same culture that carves royal domination onto palettes also learns to make small signs regulate oil, linen, and grain. No single archive from 3100 BC opens the entire machinery of the early state. Much has been lost, and much that once existed on perishable materials has disappeared. Papyrus may have been used earlier than most surviving examples can prove, but wet floodplain conditions rarely preserve such fragile things. Archaeology gives only a fraction of the system, and that fraction comes heavily from elite contexts. Still, even that fraction shows a government taking shape through repetition. By the time the first dynasty is underway, Egypt is not only a land ruled by a sacred king, it is a land increasingly managed by signs. The river remains the spine, the flood remains the rhythm, the crowns remain the visible union of north and south. But beneath the image of divine kingship runs a quieter current, officials sealing containers, marking deliveries, naming rulers, tracking goods, turning memory into procedure. Writing gives royal authority a durable nervous system. It allows the king's power to move without the king, to be recognized without his face, and to continue beyond a single moment of command. Egypt begins as a river civilization, but it endures because it learns to make the river's abundance legible. The state that learns to write also learns to remember, and in early Egypt, memory is built most powerfully in the desert edge where the dead are placed beyond the reach of the flood. The living world lies close to the river, with its fields, boats, animals, mud brick houses, workshops, and storehouses. But the cemeteries often lie where the valley gives way to dry ground, in places where the desert preserves what water would erase. This geography gives Egyptian death a lasting shape. The dead are not sent into a forgotten emptiness. They are placed at the boundary between the cultivated land and the desert, between the world renewed each year by the Nile and the dry silence where bodies, objects, and names can endure. Long before pyramids, long before the Valley of the Kings, Egypt is already learning that death can become architecture, memory, and power. In ordinary graves of the Predynastic and early dynastic periods, the human scale of this belief remains visible. A body may be placed carefully in a contracted position, sometimes accompanied by pottery, tools, ornaments, food offerings, or personal objects. The details vary by region and period, and scholars still debate how much these practices reveal about fully developed afterlife beliefs. The evidence remains incomplete because belief rarely survives in a form that explains itself. Yet the care is unmistakable. People are not simply disposed of. They are arranged, supplied, and remembered. Even modest burials suggest that the dead continue to matter to the living. But not all graves speak with the same volume. As the predynastic world becomes more unequal, cemeteries begin to show widening differences in wealth, labour, and social position. Some graves contain only a few objects. Others contain fine pottery, stone vessels, beads, ivory, copper, pigments, pallets, and goods from faraway places. Some tombs are larger, more carefully built, more richly supplied. This does not mean that every object can be translated directly into rank. Because ritual choices, family traditions, and local customs complicate the picture. Still, the pattern is strong enough to reveal a society where differences become visible even in death. Inequality is no longer only lived, it is buried. Abydos makes this transformation especially clear. At el-Kab, the desert cemetery becomes one of the great theatres of early kingship. Late predynastic elite tombs grow into royal burials of the earliest dynasties, and the shift is profound. The king's tomb is not merely larger than others, it becomes the centre of an entire ritual landscape. Goods are gathered for him. Labels and sealings identify royal property and deliveries. Offerings connect the tomb to estates, officials, craftspeople, and agricultural production. The dead king becomes an institution. His burial is not only the end of a life, but the continuation of rule through memory. This is one of the most important changes in Egypt's origin story. Earlier leaders may gain power through wealth, ritual, trade, or force, but dynastic kingship requires continuity. A ruler must not appear as an isolated strongman who rises and vanishes. He must become part of a line. The tomb helps create that line. It fixes the king in a place where successors can refer back to him, where offerings can continue, where royal identity can be tied to ancestors, and where the new state can imagine itself as older and more stable than it really is. Memory becomes political infrastructure. At Abydos and other early elite cemeteries, tomb construction also reveals command over labour. Mud brick chambers, wooden elements, storage spaces, imported materials, and large quantities of grave goods do not assemble themselves. They require planning, transport, skilled work, and food to support the people involved. A royal tomb is therefore a statement about the living as much as the dead. It says that the ruler can mobilize resources from many places and concentrate them at one sacred point. Even underground, power is being displayed. Some early royal burial complexes include subsidiary graves around the main tombs, a practice that has drawn intense scholarly attention and debate. The exact circumstances behind these burials remain difficult to reconstruct, and they should not be treated carelessly or sensationally. What can be said is that they reveal the extraordinary claims early kingship made on people, households, officials, and dependents. The king's death could draw others into the orbit of his afterlife, whether through status, service, ritual expectation, or forms of obligation that are no longer fully recoverable. Later Egyptian funerary practice will change, and symbolic substitutes will become more important. But in these earliest moments, the royal tomb already shows how sharply the king stands apart from ordinary society. The distance between ruler and commoner grows not only through wealth, but through imagination. An ordinary person may be remembered by family and local community. A king is remembered by institutions. His name is sealed onto goods. His tomb becomes a place of continuing attention. His body is surrounded by objects that draw the whole country into death food from fields, stone from desert roots, crafted vessels from workshops, materials from distant networks, and signs written by officials. In this way, the tomb becomes a map of the kingdom. It gathers Egypt around the dead ruler and makes the land appear to serve him beyond life. Yet the common dead remain important because they show what royal ideology rises above. Most people do not receive vast tombs, rare stones, or administrative labels. Their burials are smaller, quieter, and closer to the rhythms of household memory. They remind us that early Egypt is not made only of kings. It is made of farmers, herders, potters, stoneworkers, brewers, boatmen, officials, and families whose names are mostly lost. Their lives feed the state, and their graves preserve faint traces of affection, identity, belief, and local tradition. The royal cemetery may dominate the record, but it does not contain the whole society. The afterlife itself is still taking shape in this early period. Later Egypt will develop elaborate ideas about judgment, divine realms, spells, offerings, tomb decoration, and the survival of the name and soul. In the first dynasty, those later systems are not yet fully visible. It would be misleading to read the Book of the Dead backward into 3100 BC. But the roots are present, the body matters, offerings matter, names matter, place matters, and the dead require care. The tomb is not an abandoned space. It is a point of relationship between worlds. The surprising truth is that Egypt's obsession with eternity begins with practical acts: digging, lining, storing, sealing, placing, naming, and returning. Eternity starts as labour. A grave must be made, a jar must be filled, a body must be arranged, a label must be attached, a tomb must be remembered. From these repeated acts grows one of the deepest themes of Egyptian civilization, the hope that order can defeat disappearance. The dead are vulnerable to decay, forgetting, and disturbance. The tomb answers with structure, the name answers with writing, the offering answers with renewal. By the end of the early dynastic threshold, tombs have become one of the places where Egypt explains itself most clearly. They reveal hierarchy without needing a law code. They show belief without needing theology. They expose administration without needing a palace archive. They show the king's growing separation from ordinary people, but also his dependence on the labour and resources of the society beneath him. In the dry ground beyond the floodplain, Egypt learns to make memory durable. And once a civilization believes memory can be built, it is only a matter of time before tombs grow larger, names grow longer, and kings begin to dream in stone. Many early experiments in power vanish almost as soon as they appear. A strong lineage rises, a settlement grows rich, a trade route shifts, a cemetery expands, a leader gathers followers, and then the pattern breaks. Floods change, rivalries sharpen, soil fails, memory fades. Archaeology is full of beginnings that never become civilizations in the full historical sense. Egypt is different not because its rise is simple, but because once the early state forms, it proves unusually durable. Around 3100 BC, the new kingdom is still fragile, still young, still learning how to govern distance and difference. Yet it already contains the foundations of a civilization that will last, change, fracture, reunite, and endure for thousands of years. The first reason is geography, but geography alone explains nothing unless people learn how to use it. The Nile Valley gives Egypt a natural spine. The river runs through the land like a long road, making communication and transport easier than in many other ancient regions. The floodplain is narrow through much of Upper Egypt, bounded by desert, which limits some forms of invasion and concentrates settlement close to the river. The delta opens the kingdom toward the Mediterranean and the Levant, while the deserts hold stone, minerals, roots, and protective distance. This geography does not automatically create unity, but once unity exists, it helps hold the country together. A message, a jar, a boatload of grain, or an official can move along the river in a way that turns distance into connection. The Nile also gives Egypt a productive rhythm. Its flood is never perfectly predictable, and later history will show that poor inundations can cause hardship. Still, compared with many rain-fed landscapes, the river offers a recurring structure around which agriculture can be organized. Fields can be planted after the waters withdraw. Grain can be stored. Labor can be scheduled seasonally. People can be moved from farming into building, craft production, transport, or state service at certain times of year. This does not mean the early state is born from irrigation management alone. Scholars still debate the exact role of water control in early Egyptian state formation, but the river's rhythm gives administration something regular to work with, and regularity is one of civilization's quiet strengths. Agriculture gives the state its body, grain feeds households, workers, officials, craftspeople, and ritual institutions. Flax becomes linen, herds provide meat, milk, hides, traction, and status. Wetlands provide fish, birds, reeds, and plant resources. The land's abundance can be uneven, but when harvests are strong and storage is effective, surplus becomes the fuel of government. The early king does not rule only through symbols, he rules through food. A sacred crown means little if no grain moves, no beer is brewed, no workers are fed, and no offerings reach the tombs and shrines. Egypt endures because its ideology is tied to a material system that can be repeated year after year. Administration gives that system memory. The early seals, labels, and signs discussed before are modest, but they point toward a larger truth. Egypt survives because it learns to make power procedural. A kingdom cannot rely forever on charisma. A ruler dies, a battle is forgotten, a ceremony ends, but offices, storehouses, ceilings, delivery systems, scribal habits, and named institutions can continue. The state becomes stronger when authority is embedded in routines. Goods are collected, marked, stored, moved, and redistributed. Officials act in the king's name. The royal name appears on objects far from the palace. Gradually, Egypt becomes not only a land ruled by a king, but a machine capable of remembering how rule works. Ideology gives that machine a soul. This may be the most important reason Egypt endures. The early state does not present itself as a temporary arrangement made by ambitious rulers. It presents itself as the restoration and maintenance of order. The king is not simply the person at the top of a hierarchy. He is the one who holds the two lands together, defeats chaos, honors the gods, maintains offerings, and keeps the world aligned. Such a claim is enormously powerful because it turns obedience into participation in cosmic stability. To serve the king is not only to serve a man, it is to serve the order of the land. This does not mean everyone accepts royal authority equally or peacefully. No ancient state is without tension. Local loyalties remain. Communities have their own interests. Officials can compete. Resources can fail. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for ordinary people whose voices rarely survive. But the ideology of order gives Egypt a language for absorbing crisis. Disorder can be framed as something to be overcome by restoration, not as proof that the system itself is meaningless. This gives Egyptian civilization a remarkable ability to rebuild after fracture. Even when unity collapses in later periods, the ideal of unity remains available. Egypt can fall apart and still imagine itself as one land waiting to be made whole again. Ritual stability reinforces this durability. Repeated ceremonies, royal images, offerings, festivals, burials, and symbols create continuity across generations. The forms become familiar. The king smites enemies. The king wears crowns. The king appears beneath divine signs. The dead receive offerings. The gods are fed. The Nile returns. The same patterns are repeated with variations until they feel older than memory. This does not make Egyptian culture unchanging. It changes constantly beneath the surface, but it changes while preserving forms that make change appear controlled. That balance between innovation and continuity is one of Egypt's great historical talents. The desert helps preserve this sense of eternity in a very physical way. Tombs, grave goods, and inscriptions survive in dry ground when organic life in wetter places disappears. Later Egyptians will become famous for monumental stone, but even early on, the placement of the dead in desert cemeteries gives memory a durable landscape. The living fields are renewed and erased by water. The desert holds. This contrast teaches a civilization to think in two timescales at once. The seasonal return of the flood and the long stillness of the tomb. Egypt endures partly because its environment makes both renewal and preservation visible. There is also a psychological strength in boundaries. Egypt's world is open enough for trade and contact, but bounded enough to create a strong sense of identity. The river valley, delta, deserts, cataracts, and seas define a recognizable land. The contrast between the black land and the red land gives geography moral and symbolic clarity. Foreign lands are not absent from Egypt's story. They are essential to its trade, diplomacy, warfare, and imagination. But the Egyptian center remains unusually coherent. People can picture the land as a whole, and the king can claim to embody that whole. What is surprising is that the origins of this long endurance are already visible before the great monuments. The pyramids will not create Egyptian stability from nothing. They will express a stability that has already been built from river transport, grain storage, sacred kingship, administrative signs, craft specialization, ancestral memory, and the ideology of the two lands. The later grandeur is spectacular, but the foundations are older and more practical. A civilization lasts not because it is dramatic, but because it can repeat essential actions across generations. Still, nothing about Egypt's survival is inevitable. A different climate sequence, a weaker administrative tradition, stronger local fragmentation, failed harvests at the wrong moment, or a less persuasive ideology could have produced a very different history. The first state could have broken into regional powers and remained one experiment among many. Instead, the early Egyptians managed to bind geography, food, ritual, writing, and kingship into a system resilient enough to survive its own rulers. That is the deeper achievement. Egypt does not endure because it avoids change. It endures because it gives change a framework strong enough to contain it. By the time the early dynasties settle into memory, Egypt has become more than a political territory. It has become an idea of order beside a river. The villages, symbols, tombs, and trade routes of the predynastic world have not disappeared. They have been gathered into something larger, something capable of naming itself, remembering itself, and repeating itself. The civilization that began in 3100 BC is still young, but it has already learned the secret that will define its ancient life. Power survives when it can make itself look like the natural shape of the world. A civilization does not only begin when people build institutions, it begins again when later generations decide how that beginning should be remembered. For the Egyptians who live centuries after Narmer, the origins of their world are not a messy sequence of villages, trade routes, climate shifts, regional rivalries, administrative experiments, and slowly hardening symbols. They inherit a cleaner story, because every civilization needs a past it can hold. Egypt becomes, in its own memory, the land of the two lands joined under kingship, the realm where order is restored again and again, the place where the ruler stands between the gods and the earth. The real beginning remains buried in graves, broken pots, ceilings, pallets, and settlement traces. The remembered beginning becomes sacred history. This difference between archaeology and memory is one of the deepest mysteries of ancient Egypt. Archaeology shows uncertainty. Later tradition shows confidence. Archaeology sees regional variation, lost communities, competing centers, and fragile experiments in authority. Later royal ideology sees a line of kings stretching backward into ordered time. The early state has to invent continuity, and once it succeeds, continuity becomes one of Egypt's most powerful possessions. The past is not simply preserved, it is shaped until it supports the present. King lists are part of this shaping. Later Egyptians record sequences of rulers, dynasties, and names, giving time a royal skeleton. These lists are invaluable, but they are not neutral history in the modern sense. They can omit, rearrange, simplify, or transform memory according to political and religious needs. A ruler who belongs in archaeology may fade from tradition. A remembered founder may gather qualities from several real figures, Narmer, Menes, and the shadowy names around them stand near this difficult boundary between record and legend. Scholars still debate exactly how these early identities relate to one another, because later memory compresses the beginning into forms easier to honor than to analyze. The idea of Menes is especially revealing. In later accounts, Menes appears as a founder, the one who unifies Egypt and begins the dynastic order. Whether he is Narmer, a fusion of early rulers, or a remembered name attached to a broader process remains debated. But his importance lies not only in who he was, it lies in what the Egyptians needed him to represent. A civilization that sees itself as ordered by kingship benefits from a first king. A unified land benefits from a unifier. A long history benefits from a recognizable starting point. Menes becomes a human marker for a transformation that archaeology suggests was larger than any single life. This is not deception in any simple sense. Ancient memory does not work like a modern archive. It arranges the past around meaning. The Egyptians remember origins through kings, gods, rituals, places, and repeated images. The beginning is true because it explains the world they inhabit. The two lands are united because the king wears the crowns. Chaos is defeated because the king smites enemies. Ancestors are powerful because their tombs receive offerings. The Nile's renewal is meaningful because ritual gives it place in the cosmic order. In this system, memory is not just about what happened. It is about why the world still holds together. Abydos becomes one of the great landscapes of this remembered beginning. The early royal tombs there do not remain only archaeological features in the desert. They become ancestral anchors, places where kingship looks backward to its own origins. Later, Egyptians return to Abydos with devotion, myth, and pilgrimage. especially as the site becomes linked to Osiris and the hope of renewed life. The earliest royal dead are gradually absorbed into a wider sacred geography. What began as dynastic burial becomes holy memory. The desert cemetery turns into a place where the beginning of kingship and the mystery of death speak to one another across centuries. Hierakonpolis also remains important in a different way. As an early centre associated with Horus, it preserves the memory of a time when local power, ritual, and kingship were still close to the surface. The falcon god, already connected with early royal identity, continues to shape Egyptian kingship for millennia. The king's Horus name remains one of the essential ways of defining him. This continuity gives the impression that the system was always complete. But the deeper story is more fascinating. The polished theology of later Egypt grows from a rougher predynastic world where animals, standards, rulers, and ritual signs were still being tested, merged, and made durable. The Narmer palette becomes almost emblematic of this entire process. It is both an early object and a later obsession. A stone surface modern scholars return to again and again because it seems to show Egypt becoming itself. But even the palette participates in myth-making. It does not simply report the beginning. It gives the beginning a visual structure, the king larger than others, the enemy subdued, the crowns displayed, the land brought into order. Whether it records one event or a ceremonial claim, it reveals the royal memory Egypt wants to create. A complicated political transformation becomes an image that can be grasped at a glance. Later Egyptian civilization will continue to live inside that image. From temple walls to royal inscriptions, from tomb scenes to ceremonial objects, the same deep grammar repeats. The king restores order. The king defeats chaos. The king makes offerings. The king unites what might divide. Even when real history is full of weak rulers, local conflicts, foreign rule, economic strain, and political fragmentation, the ideal remains. Egypt can suffer collapse and still remember itself as a land meant for unity. That may be one reason the civilization endures so long. It carries an origin story strong enough to survive contradiction. Yet modern archaeology has changed that origin story again. It has returned attention to the unnamed people beneath the royal memory farmers along the floodplain, herders moving between river and desert, craft specialists drilling beads and carving stone, brewers preparing food and drink for gatherings, officials marking jars, families burying their dead, communities adapting as the Sahara dries and the Nile becomes central. The old story of Egypt beginning with a king is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The king is the final visible form of a much older transformation. Before there is Narmer, there is a world learning how to become governable. The most powerful image of Egypt's beginning may therefore not be a crown, a tomb, or a palette alone. It may be the moment when all these things become connected: the river's flood, the village storehouse, the desert route, the elite grave, the marked jar, the animal symbol, the sacred ceremony, the ruler's name. Civilization begins when these separate elements start to reinforce one another. Food supports authority. Authority commands craft. Craft produces symbols. Symbols justify power. Power organizes memory. Memory makes the system seem ancient. By 3100 BC, that circle has closed tightly enough for Egypt to stand before history as a kingdom. What remains mysterious is how human and fragile it all is at the beginning. Later Egypt looks eternal because stone has survived and royal imagery was designed to resist time. But the first state is made by people who do not know they are founding one of the most famous civilizations in history. They are responding to floods, droughts, rivalries, opportunities, ancestors, animals, gods, and the pressures of living close together in a narrow land. They are experimenting with order. Only later does that experiment become destiny. And so Egypt remembers itself, but not completely. It remembers the crowns better than the hands that shape the clay. It remembers the kings better than the villages that fed them. It remembers unity better than the long uncertainty that made unity possible. Archaeology does not destroy that memory. It deepens it. It shows that behind the first dynasties stands a much older human story, one made from movement, adaptation, ambition, belief, and the slow discovery that a river valley could become a world. And after all of this, the beginning of Egypt grows quiet again. The river still moves north, as it did before there were crowns, before there were royal tombs, before a king's name could be pressed into clay and carried across the land. The flood rises and withdraws. Reeds bend in the marshes. Desert wind moves over cemeteries where the earliest traces of ambition, grief, belief, and memory lie in dry ground. The people who made this world are mostly unnamed now. Their voices do not survive. Their songs, worries, family stories, and ordinary hopes have passed beyond recovery. But their work remains in fragments: a polished pot, a carved sign, a stone pallet, a grave cut into sand, a seed blackened by fire, a seal impression hardened by time. Egypt's origin is often remembered through kings, and perhaps that is unavoidable. Kings leave sharper marks. They build larger tombs. They command artists, officials, and later historians. But the deeper beginning is wider and softer. It belongs to farmers watching the riverbank, herders moving along desert edges, craftspeople learning the patience of stone, families returning to burial grounds, travellers carrying rare materials through heat and distance, and communities slowly discovering that life beside the Nile could be organised into something larger than any one village. Around 3100 BC, that larger thing finds a royal shape. It calls itself order. It joins north and south. It gives the land a sacred centre. It turns the river's rhythm into administration, the desert's danger into symbolism, the dead into ancestors, and power into a language that can last. Yet beneath the grandeur, the first Egypt remains human. It is not inevitable. It is not perfect. It is an answer made by people living inside uncertainty. What survives is never the whole story. The evidence remains incomplete, and many doors stay closed, but enough remains to see the outline of a transformation so vast that its effects still reach across the modern imagination. Before the pyramids, before the temples, before the golden masks and painted tombs, there was this long gathering beside the river: mud, grain, cattle, boats, desert paths, symbols, graves, and memory slowly became civilization. And the Nile continues beyond them all, carrying silt, reflection, and silence through the narrow green land, past the places where Egypt first learned to remember itself.